Julia Carter thought her life was perfect, until she discovered her husband Tom was having an affair with her own mother, Carol. What started as a seemingly innocent connection spiraled into a betrayal so deep, it shattered their family and tore apart everything Julia believed she knew about love, loyalty, and trust. Julia and Tom Carter had always seemed like the epitome of a perfect family. Living in a beautiful, quiet suburban neighborhood, they were the kind of couple everyone envied. Their house was spacious, well-kept, and adorned with all the trappings of a life well lived. Julia, a devoted stay-at-home mom, focused all her energy on caring for their two children, Lily and Ben. She was known for her warmth, her kindness, and her impeccable ability to balance the chaos of parenting, while keeping the house running smoothly. Tom, her husband, was a successful lawyer who worked long hours but was well respected in his field. Together, they created a life that many would consider enviable. A life full of stability, comfort, and happiness. On the surface, everything seemed flawless. Julia and Tom's marriage appeared rock solid. They were partners in every sense of the word, always attending events together, always showing support for one another, and always presenting a united front. Julia's friends would often comment on how lucky she was to have such a devoted and caring husband. Tom, for his part, was proud of the family they had built and worked tirelessly to provide for them. Their children were well-mannered and thriving, excelling in school and extracurricular activities. To anyone looking from the outside, the Carters were the picture of success. But as is often the case in many relationships, the perfect exterior was only a facade. Beneath the surface, the Carter household was far from the idealized life that it seemed to portray. Tom had begun to grow distant over the past few months. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. He began working longer hours at the office, coming home later than usual, often too tired or preoccupied to spend quality time with Julia. At first, she assumed it was just the pressures of his job getting to him. After all, being a lawyer came with its stresses, and Tom had always been a hard worker. She dismissed his behavior as a temporary phase, something that would pass once his workload lightened. But the distance between them grew, and Julia found herself feeling more alone in her marriage than ever before. She tried to reach out, but Tom would often respond with excuses, meetings that ran late, deadlines that were looming, or client demands that couldn't be ignored. As weeks turned into months, Julia started questioning what had happened to the intimacy they once shared. They rarely had time for each other, and when they did, their conversations seemed strained, lacking the connection they had once enjoyed. Julia couldn't help but wonder if Tom was losing interest in her, in their marriage, or perhaps something else was at play. The thought of it haunted her, but she pushed it aside, convincing herself it was just a phase. Around the same time, a new dynamic entered the household. Julia's mother, Carol, had recently gone through a difficult divorce and had nowhere else to turn. With nowhere to go, she moved in with the Carters, bringing a different energy into the household. Carol was lively, independent, and full of stories that captivated Julia and the children. She was a breath of fresh air in what had become a tense and distant home. Julia was happy to have her mother around, especially since Carol had always been there for her throughout her life. She thought that having Carol in the house would bring a sense of comfort and warmth back to their family. Little did she know Carol's presence in the home would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Tom, who had already started pulling away from Julia, found himself drawn to Carol's personality. She was confident, sharp, and engaging in a way that made her impossible to ignore. They spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing their thoughts on various topics. What started as innocent conversations soon turned into something more, something neither of them had anticipated. The connection between them grew stronger, and though neither of them fully understood it at the time, it marked the beginning of something that would tear their family apart. While Julia was busy with the kids and focused on keeping the house running smoothly, She remained unaware of the growing tension between her husband and her mother. She had no reason to suspect that the seemingly innocent conversations between Tom and Carol were anything but friendly. The cracks in her marriage were already starting to widen, but she couldn't see them yet, believing that things would get better in time. She never could have imagined what was quietly unfolding beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to unravel everything she thought she knew. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a creeping shadow that neither Tom nor Carol could fully comprehend at first. At first, their interactions were harmless. A cup of coffee here, a shared conversation there. Tom had always admired Carol for her intelligence, her wit, and her ability to listen. She was, after all, his mother-in-law, but there was something undeniably magnetic about her presence. She had a warmth that Julia often lacked in the way she interacted with Tom. Carol's independence, her confidence, and her ability to make people feel seen and heard drew Tom in. Carol, for her part, had never been the type to depend on anyone, and after her divorce she had become even more self-reliant. Her marriage had ended badly, and she had retreated into herself, convinced that emotional attachments were best avoided. But when she moved in with Julia and Tom, something changed. She was drawn to Tom's quiet strength, his vulnerability hidden beneath the facade of success. He was kind, handsome, and respected by everyone. His charm was undeniable, and even though she never consciously acknowledged it, she found herself seeking his company more and more. It began innocently enough with long discussions after dinner. Julia would often be busy cleaning up after the kids, leaving Tom and Carol to linger in the kitchen, chatting about life, family, and the trivialities of the day. Their exchanges grew deeper, more personal. Carol found herself confiding in Tom about her failed marriage, her fears about aging, and her uncertainty about the future. Tom, feeling the weight of his own frustrations with his marriage, began to open up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. There was a sense of understanding between them, a connection that felt rare and authentic. The boundary between friendship and something more started to blur when their conversations began to shift in tone. What had been casual talks about their respective lives turned into more intimate exchanges. Tom found himself looking forward to these moments with Carol, desperate for the kind of emotional intimacy he hadn't felt with Julia in months. Carol, too, began to look for excuses to spend time with Tom. The more time they spent together, the more their relationship evolved from simple companionship to something more dangerous. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Carol found herself sitting next to Tom on the couch, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't fully explain. The conversation had shifted from something lighthearted to a deeper discussion about regrets and desires. It was then that the lines between mother-in-law and son-in-law, between family and something else, started to fade. Tom looked at Carol in a way he had never looked at her before, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach flutter. It wasn't just admiration. It was something more, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment they both said nothing, the silence hanging heavy between them. It was as though they were waiting for permission, for someone, anyone, to make the first move. Then, as if on cue, their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, but it deepened quickly, fueled by months of unspoken emotions and suppressed desires. In that moment, neither of them could stop what was happening, even though they both knew it was wrong. Even though they both knew the consequences of their actions would be catastrophic. The affair had begun. What started as an innocent, albeit growing emotional connection between Tom and Carol now spiraled into something much darker. They continued their secret meetings, always careful to ensure that Julia and the children never discovered what was happening behind closed doors. The guilt was overwhelming at times, but it was overshadowed by the raw intensity of their attraction to one another. Both Tom and Carol knew they were crossing a line, but neither was ready to stop. The excitement, the thrill of doing something forbidden, made it feel almost impossible to resist. At first, they convinced themselves that it was just a temporary lapse, something they could both forget about once the excitement wore off. But deep down, they knew that this affair was not something either of them could easily walk away from. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger, and the secret they shared became a dangerous weight they both carried, one that would eventually shatter the lives of everyone involved. The affair had escalated quickly, and with it came the consequences neither Tom nor Carol had anticipated. What had started as a brief moment of weakness had turned into something far more complicated and dangerous. Carol, in the midst of a whirlwind of emotions, began to feel the heavy weight of what was happening, but it was the discovery of a simple fact that would soon propel their secret into the open. Carol was pregnant. It didn't happen overnight. At first, Carol dismissed the signs, attributing the changes in her body to stress, age, and a mix of other things that seemed more plausible. She ignored the nausea, the missed periods, the constant fatigue. But as the weeks passed, the reality settled in, undeniable and terrifying. She was pregnant, with Tom's child. The moment she saw the positive test result, panic set in. Carol felt sick, both physically and emotionally. She had never intended for things to go this far, and the thought of carrying the child of her daughter as husband felt like a betrayal too deep to comprehend. The guilt was crushing, and for a brief moment Carol considered ending it all, just as a way to escape the mess they had created. But she couldn't bring herself to take such a drastic step. The child growing inside her was innocent, and no matter how much she regretted the affair, this was not something she could undo. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the situation. The very idea of telling Tom was overwhelming. They had both been so careful, so cautious in their deceit, and yet now they were faced with a truth that neither could escape. Tom had always been more distant lately, but how could she even begin to tell him about this? Would he see the pregnancy as a mistake? Would he want to keep it? Or would he abandon her, as he had done so many times before in other parts of their marriage? Carol's fears were not unwarranted. Tom had already begun pulling away, distancing himself from Julia. The strain was noticeable to anyone who paid attention, but it was especially painful for Julia, who had always prided herself on knowing her husband better than anyone else. And now, Carol knew that she was involved in a betrayal so deep, it would destroy not just her daughter's marriage but her relationship with Julia forever. Weeks passed, and Carol's growing belly became more difficult to conceal. She did everything she could to hide it from Julia, wearing loose clothing and staying away from events where the family would gather, but even the most careful of lies can unravel. One afternoon, as Carol moved through the house adjusting a pillow on the couch, Julia's eyes caught a glimpse of something that didn't make sense. Her mother's shape was different. Carol was usually slim, but there was a roundness to her stomach that Julia hadn't noticed before. At first, Julia didn't say anything. Perhaps she assumed it was just the result of a few too many indulgences or the natural course of aging. But in the back of her mind, something didn't sit right. Over the next few days, Julia observed her mother more closely. She noticed the way Carol kept her distance, the way she avoided certain activities and conversations. It was all too strange to ignore. And so, the question began to haunt Julia. What was going on? Why did her mother look different? Why had she been acting strangely? Meanwhile, Carol, unable to continue living in denial, began to feel the pressure of the secret she had been carrying. Every moment with Tom was now laced with a growing sense of dread, knowing that soon they would have to confront the reality of the pregnancy. And when that time came, There was no turning back. It was a ticking time bomb, and Carol had no idea how to defuse it. She had one more choice: tell Tom and face the consequences together, or try to hide it until the truth came crashing down in the most painful way possible. Neither option felt remotely like a good one, but as her body changed and the truth became undeniable, she realized that there was no way to protect her family from the storm that was coming. The weight of the lie was already too heavy to bear, and soon everything would come crashing down. The day the truth began to unravel was like any other, at least on the surface. The Carters had gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, the children running around in the living room while Julia set the table. Tom was late, as usual, but Julia had grown accustomed to this. She assumed he'd been held up at work again, as he often was these days. Carol, her mother, was sitting at the kitchen table looking pensive, as if the weight of something was bearing down on her. Julia noticed it but didn't think much of it. Carol often seemed lost in her thoughts. As they all sat down to eat, the evening began like any other, though Julia could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual stress. There was something different, something heavy that she couldn't quite place. Tom's absence was starting to feel more permanent, even though he had just walked through the door. He kissed Julia on the cheek, but his touch was cold, distracted. He hardly noticed as Lily and Ben chattered on about their day. After dinner, the family moved into the living room, but the conversation felt stilted. Tom sat on the couch glancing at his phone, his mind elsewhere. Carol was unusually quiet, and Julia found herself wondering if something was wrong. The last few weeks had been a blur of suspicion, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach, an instinct that wouldn't let go. Finally, unable to ignore her growing anxiety, Julia excused herself to the kitchen. Carol, as if sensing Julia's unease, followed her, her footsteps echoing softly in the hallway. In the kitchen, Julia put her hands on the counter, her mind racing. Carol stood behind her, silent for a long moment. It was then that Julia decided to confront her. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What's going on? Something's not right. I can feel it." Carol hesitated. Her hands gripped the back of the chair as though she were holding herself upright. Her face was pale and her lips trembled as she looked at her daughter. Julia's heart raced as she watched Carol, searching her face for some clue, some sign that everything was still okay. But Carol didn't speak right away. She couldn't. The guilt was suffocating, and the truth felt like a weight that she couldn't bear much longer. Julia's words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. "Is there something you're not telling me? You've been acting strange, Mom, I know you have." Finally, Carol broke. Her voice cracked as she said the words that shattered everything. "I've been seeing Tom." Julia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't process what she had just heard. For a moment it felt as if the room had gone silent, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Carol's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Julia. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but it did. It happened." The air between them seemed to grow thick, suffocating. Julia stood there, unable to move, her mind struggling to make sense of the words. The betrayal was so deep, so unexpected, that her body went numb. Her mother, the woman she had trusted more than anyone, had been having an affair with her husband for months. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. And as the truth hit her like a tidal wave, she realized that this wasn't the end of it. Carol wasn't just telling her about the affair. There was something more, a deeper consequence that Carol had yet to reveal. Carol hesitated, almost as though she were searching for the right words to say. And then it came. the bombshell that Julia hadn't been prepared for. "I'm pregnant," Carol whispered, her face crumpling with the weight of the confession. "It's Tom's baby." The room spun. Julia couldn't breathe. The world seemed to collapse around her as the truth sank in. Her mother, her own flesh and blood, was carrying the child of the man she had loved for years, the man she had trusted, the man who had been the father of her children. Her mind screamed, but her body was paralyzed with shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was unbearable, thick with shame and sorrow. Julia, barely able to hold herself together, backed away from her mother, the betrayal too great to bear. Her legs wobbled, and she sank into a chair, her head spinning with disbelief. Carol stood there sobbing softly as if all the tears in the world couldn't wash away the damage they had done. As the truth hung in the air like a heavy fog, Julia knew that her life, her marriage, and her relationship with her mother would never be the same. The woman she had once loved and trusted had betrayed her in the worst way possible, and there was no coming back from it. The days following Carol's confession were a blur of raw emotions and harsh realities. Julia was numb, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. She moved through the motions of daily life as if trapped in a dream, unable to wake up. The betrayal was too overwhelming, too surreal to fully comprehend. Her once idyllic family had turned into something unrecognizable, and she had no idea how to fix it, if it could even be fixed. After the confrontation in the kitchen, Julia hadn't been able to face Tom. He had come home later that evening, his usual excuses of late meetings and overwhelming work duties falling flat in the face of the truth. His eyes had met hers, and in that single excruciating glance she saw everything. The guilt, the shame, the realization that everything had fallen apart. But he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. What could he say that would make this right? That night, Julia barely slept. She lay in bed, her mind consumed by what Carol had told her. Her mother, her own mother, was pregnant with Tom's child. The weight of it all was suffocating. How could she have been so blind? How could she not have seen the cracks, the subtle hints that something was wrong? How had Tom and Carol, two people she trusted above all others, conspired to destroy everything? In the morning, Julia made the decision to leave. She couldn't stay in that house, not with the memories of what had happened there. She needed space, distance from the people who had shattered her world. She packed her things quietly, while Tom was still in bed. The children were at school, and she knew she couldn't face them yet. The thought of explaining everything to them, how their mother and father had betrayed her, how Grandma Carol was having a baby with their dad, was more than she could bear. She couldn't process the devastation herself, let alone figure out how to explain it to her children. When Tom woke up and found the note she left behind, he was filled with a deep sense of dread. He immediately called her, but she didn't answer. He drove to her mother's house, hoping to find some trace of her, some sign that she hadn't completely disappeared from his life. Carol was the one who answered the door, and Tom could see the guilt and sorrow in her eyes. The woman who had once been so vibrant, so full of life, looked broken, like a shell of the person she had been. Tom barely knew how to address the situation. He had ruined everything. Julia was gone, and he was left standing on the edge of a life that no longer made sense. Meanwhile, Carol withdrew even further, knowing that her actions had cost her not just her relationship with her daughter, but also the respect she had once held in the community. She had gone from being Julia's protector, her confidant, to the woman who had destroyed her family. No apology, no explanation could undo the damage. Carol tried to reach out to Julia to offer an apology, but Julia refused to answer her calls. There was no path forward for them. Carol knew that. As the weeks passed, Tom and Julia's divorce became inevitable. Their attempts at reconciliation fell apart quickly. The trust, Once the bedrock of their relationship had been obliterated, Tom was left with the wreckage of his actions, unable to piece together the fragments of the life he had once cherished. Julia, though devastated, was determined to rebuild. She focused on the children who were confused and hurt, but too young to fully understand what had happened. As difficult as it was, Julia knew she had to remain strong for them. Tom, for his part, tried to salvage something from the wreckage. He moved into a small apartment, and for the first time he was forced to confront the gravity of what he had done. His career, once his greatest priority, seemed insignificant now. His relationship with Carol, though strained, continued, but it was no longer the affair it had once been. Carol had become a distant figure in his life, someone he couldn't fully forgive or forget, but someone he was still tied to because of the child she was carrying. But for Julia, the road to healing was far longer and more painful. She moved forward slowly, finding strength in her friends and in the memories of the life she once had. It wasn't easy, and the scars from that time would never fully fade. But Julia began to rebuild her life piece by piece, one day at a time. She focused on her children, her work, and slowly, the anger and heartbreak gave way to something more manageable: acceptance. Her relationship with Carol was beyond repair. The betrayal was too deep, the hurt too raw. Julia knew that she would never be able to look at her mother the same way again, but she also knew that she had to move on, for her sake and for the sake of her children. Tom, for his part, tried to reach out in the years that followed, but Julia could never fully forgive him. The damage had been done. In the end, their story became a quiet, cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most perfect-seeming families could crumble, that secrets could tear apart the very foundation of trust. Tom and Julia, once a shining example of love and success, would never be the same, and neither would Carol. Their lives, irrevocably altered, moved forward in separate directions, each carrying the weight of their choices.